I never believed objects could feel heavy with intent until the day my father died and left me alone in his house. Not the emotional weight people talk about, not the grief that presses on your chest like a stone, but a physical heaviness, as if certain things were waiting for your hands, waiting for the exact moment you were weakest. The diary was one of them. It sat at the back of his wardrobe, hidden behind winter coats he hadn't worn in years, wrapped in an old cotton scarf that smelled faintly of cedar and something bitter I couldn't place. I didn't even know it existed until I was clearing out his room, doing the practical things people tell you help with mourning, like sorting socks and stacking papers, pretending that order can protect you from loss. My father, Daniel Harris, had been a quiet man, reliable, predictable, the kind of person neighbors trusted with spare keys and secrets, the kind of man teachers praised at parent meetings for being solid. After my mother died when I was 12, he became my entire world. He packed my lunches, helped with homework, sat through terrible school plays with the same patient smile. When he died suddenly from a heart attack, the story everyone told was simple. A good man, a devoted father. A life that ended too soon. I clung to that story because it was the only thing holding me together. The diary was locked, a small brass lock, old-fashioned, almost decorative. I remember thinking it was strange, almost theatrical. My father had never locked anything in his life. Not doors, not drawers, not even his phone. The idea that there was something he'd felt the need to protect from the world, or from me, made my stomach tighten. I told myself I would put it back. I told myself it wasn't my place. But grief doesn't make you wise, it makes you reckless. It whispers that you deserve answers, that you're entitled to everything the dead leave behind. If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people. Because what I found in that diary wasn't just about me. It was about the kind of secrets families bury until they rot. I found the key an hour later, taped inside a book he'd kept on his nightstand, a book he reread every year without fail. That should have been my second warning. The first was the way my hands shook when the lock clicked open, a soft sound that felt far too loud in the quiet room. I remember sitting on the edge of his bed, diary resting on my knees, my heart beating so hard I was sure I would be sick. I expected confessions. Affairs, maybe. Regrets. The normal, hidden lives people like to imagine their parents had. I wasn't prepared for what was actually there. The first pages were ordinary. Dates, weather notes, comments about work, about me. Emily did well on her exam today. Emily laughed so hard at dinner she spilled her drink. Reading those lines felt like touching him again, like proof that the man I loved was real. I cried. I almost closed the diary then. Almost. Then the tone changed. There was a gap of several weeks between entries, and when they resumed, the handwriting was tighter, angrier. He wrote about being watched, about mistakes that couldn't be undone, about a promise he'd made long before I was born. Names appeared that I didn't recognize, places I'd never heard of. And then there was my name, written again and again, surrounded by sentences that made my breath catch. She must never know. I will protect her no matter the cost. If this ever comes out, everything will burn. I told myself he was being dramatic. People write strange things when they're stressed. But the deeper I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't metaphor. It was a record. A confession stretched across years. My father wasn't writing for comfort. He was writing to remember, to keep something straight in his mind that terrified him. By the time I reached the middle of the diary, my grief had twisted into something sharp and metallic. He wrote about my birth, about my mother, about a night that was never mentioned in family stories. According to him, I wasn't supposed to exist. Not in the way I did. There had been another man, another life intersecting with theirs, a choice made in panic and sealed with silence. My father wrote that he stepped in to fix things, that he believed love could overwrite blood. He wrote that raising me was both his redemption and his punishment. Comment justice if you believe she deserved justice. Because in that moment, I realized my entire life had been built on a lie I never agreed to. I slammed the diary shut, my hands numb. The room felt wrong, as if the walls had shifted while I wasn't looking. Every memory I had of my father suddenly felt suspect. Every look, every rule, every moment of affection replayed itself with a new, darker edge. Had he loved me out of guilt, out of fear? Or had he truly been the man I thought he was, trapped by something bigger than both of us? I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor of his bedroom, diary pressed against my chest like a wound, listening to the house creak and settle, imagining footsteps that weren't there. Part of me wanted to burn the diary, to destroy the words before they destroyed me. Another part needed to know everything. Secrets lose their power when they're dragged into the light, people say. What they don't tell you is that sometimes the light burns you first. By morning, I had made a decision I would come to regret. I was going to finish reading. Whatever my father had done, whatever he had hidden, I needed to face it. Because if my life had been shaped by his choices, then I deserved to know exactly who I was and why. I just didn't yet understand how high the price of that knowledge would be. By the second morning after his funeral, the diary had become my shadow. I carried it from room to room, afraid to leave it behind, afraid someone else might find it and read it before I was ready to understand it myself. The house felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were leaning in to listen. Every familiar object now seemed complicit, like it knew something about my father that I hadn't. His favorite mug, the framed photo of us at the beach, the old clock that ticked too loudly in the hallway. All of it felt staged, like props in a play where I'd just discovered the script was fake. I picked up where I'd left off, telling myself I would stop if it became too much. That was a lie. The next entries went deeper into the story he'd only hinted at before. He wrote about a man named Michael, about how my mother had loved him once, long before she met my father, about how Michael had come back into her life briefly, unexpectedly, at a time when my parents' marriage was already cracking under quiet resentments. My father described that period with brutal honesty, admitting his jealousy, his fear, his sense that he was losing something he'd never fully possessed. Then came the part that made my hands go cold. According to the diary, my mother hadn't planned to leave my father. She hadn't planned anything at all. The pregnancy had been an accident, discovered too late to deny, too early to explain. My father wrote about standing in the kitchen, listening as my mother cried, insisting that she didn't know what to do. He wrote that Michael wanted to be involved, wanted to tell the truth. My father wrote that he couldn't let that happen. The words on the page didn't scream. They didn't accuse. They just sat there, quiet and final. He described convincing my mother that the safest path was silence, that he would raise me as his own, that Michael would disappear. He called it a sacrifice. He called it love. He never once called it theft. I felt sick, not because I suddenly loved my father less, but because I didn't know how to love him at all anymore. The man who taught me to ride a bike and the man who erased someone else from my life were now the same person. There was no way to separate them, no way to neatly categorize him as hero or villain. That ambiguity hurt more than outright cruelty would have. As I read on, it became clear that the story didn't end there. Michael hadn't simply vanished. He'd tried to reach out over the years, letters returned unopened, calls that went unanswered. My father wrote about intercepting them, about telling himself it was necessary. He wrote about the night Michael showed up at our house when I was 6, standing across the street, watching the lights in our living room. I had no memory of that night, but my father did. He wrote that he stayed awake until dawn, gripping a baseball bat, convinced that everything he'd built was about to collapse. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once, because that's when I realized my father hadn't just hidden a truth. He'd been fighting a war I never knew existed. The later entries were filled with exhaustion, guilt, fear that one day I would find out and hate him, fear that Michael would resurface and tear everything apart. My father wrote that every birthday candle I blew out was another reminder of the lie he was living. He wrote that he loved me more fiercely because of it, because he knew he was borrowing time that didn't truly belong to him. That line broke something in me. Borrowing time. As if my life had been a loan taken out in secret. I closed the diary again, this time more gently. My hands were aching, my eyes burning from reading and crying and staring at words I couldn't unsee. I tried to imagine Michael's face, tried to picture what it would feel like to look at someone who shared my blood and not know whether to thank them or blame them. I wondered if he was still alive, if he'd ever moved on, if he'd hated my father or pitied him or both. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my aunt, my father's sister, calling to check on me. Her voice was warm, familiar, concerned. She asked if I was eating, if I was sleeping, if I needed anything. I almost told her everything. The words sat at the back of my throat, heavy and dangerous. Instead, I lied. I said I was fine. After I hung up, I realized with a jolt that lying had come easily, too easily. I wondered how many lies like that my father had told over the years, how many times he'd chosen the version of reality that kept the peace. By evening, I was angry, not just hurt or confused, but furious. Furious that my life had been shaped by decisions I never got to question. Furious that my mother, who had died believing I knew the truth, had taken this secret to her grave. Furious that my father had robbed me of the choice to know where I came from. Love didn't erase that. Love didn't excuse it. I went back to the diary one more time that night and reached the final pages. The last entry was dated only a week before my father died. The handwriting was shakier, the sentences shorter. He wrote that his heart wasn't strong anymore, that he could feel something ending. He wrote that if I ever read the diary, he hoped I would understand why he'd done what he'd done. He hoped I would forgive him. He hoped I would be kinder to him in death than he had been to others in life. I sat there for a long time after finishing that entry, the house dark around me, the diary open on my lap like an accusation. Forgiveness felt impossible. So did forgetting. I realized then that the diary wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much worse. Because now that I knew the truth, I had to decide what to do with it. And every option in front of me threatened to destroy someone, my father's memory, Michael's life, or my own fragile sense of self. The third day after the funeral, I left the house for the first time with a purpose that wasn't errands or condolences. I needed air, distance, something that wasn't saturated with my father's presence. I drove without thinking, letting muscle memory guide me through familiar streets until I found myself parked outside the public library where my mother used to take me when I was little. It felt symbolic in a way I couldn't articulate. If my life was a story rewritten without my consent, then maybe this was the place to start reading between the lines. I brought the diary with me, tucked deep into my bag, though I didn't intend to open it there. I sat at a table near the window and stared outside instead, watching people pass by with their uncomplicated lives, or at least lives that looked uncomplicated from the outside. I wondered how many of them were carrying secrets just as heavy as mine. How many smiles were built on omissions? How many families were held together by lies everyone agreed not to examine too closely? Eventually, I pulled out my phone and typed Michael's name into the search bar. My hands hesitated over the screen before I hit enter. It felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The results came back slowly, loading piece by piece, and when they did, my breath caught. There were several Michaels, of course, but one result stood out. Same last name my father had mentioned. Same city. A photo attached to a professional profile. He was older than I'd imagined, his hair threaded with gray, his eyes familiar in a way that made my chest ache. I stared at that photo far longer than was reasonable, searching for myself in his face. I didn't reach out that day, or the next, knowing where he was felt dangerous enough. It was proof that the past hadn't vanished just because my father had willed it to. It was proof that I could, if I chose, pull this secret out of the shadows and let it breathe. But what would that cost? Michael had a family of his own according to the profile. A wife. 2 children. What right did I have to disrupt their lives with my father's long-buried confession? That night, I dreamed of my mother. She stood in our old kitchen, younger than I remembered her, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, half apology, half relief. I woke up with tears on my pillow and a question pounding in my head. If she were alive, what would she tell me to do? Would she beg me to keep the peace, the way my father had? Or would she finally admit that silence had been a mistake? The following week was a blur of paperwork and well-meaning visitors. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone assumed my grief followed a neat, predictable path. No one suspected that beneath my polite smiles, I was unraveling. The diary stayed hidden in a locked drawer now, but its presence felt louder than ever. I found myself replaying moments from my childhood, scanning them for clues I might have missed. A strange tension in my parents' voices. The way my father sometimes watched me with an intensity that now felt like fear rather than pride. By the end of that week, the anger had settled into something colder, determination. I realized that my father's greatest crime hadn't been the lie itself, but the way it had stripped me of agency. He'd decided unilaterally what I could handle, what I deserved to know, and that was something I couldn't forgive easily. I didn't know yet what justice looked like in this situation, but I knew silence wasn't it. I drafted an email to Michael late one night, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I tried to find words that wouldn't shatter lives on impact. I deleted it. Then I wrote another. Then another. None of them felt right. How do you introduce yourself to a stranger who is, by accident and betrayal, part of who you are? How do you say, I exist because of a secret you were never allowed to acknowledge? Share this video so communities understand what was hiding, because stories like this don't stay contained. They ripple outward, touching everyone connected to them. In the end, I chose honesty over elegance. I wrote simply. I said my name. I said who my mother was. I said my father had died and left behind a diary that raised questions I could no longer ignore. I told him I wasn't looking for anything specific, only the truth. I read the email 5 times before sending it, each time feeling like I was stepping closer to a cliff. The reply didn't come immediately. Hours passed. Then a day. I started to regret everything, imagining the confusion and anger my message might have caused. On the second evening, my phone buzzed. The email was short. Michael said he had wondered over the years if this moment would ever come. He said he needed time to process. He said he would like to talk, but only if I was sure. I wasn't sure of anything, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. We arranged to meet at a cafe halfway between our cities, neutral ground. The morning of the meeting, I almost didn't go. My hands shook as I drove, my stomach tight with dread. I kept thinking about my father's final wish, written in shaky ink, that I would be kinder to him in death than he had been to others in life. Was this kindness or betrayal? When I walked into the cafe, I recognized Michael immediately. He stood as I approached, his expression a mixture of nervousness and awe. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, and I saw it, my smile reflected back at me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever else my father had taken or given, this connection was real. Blood didn't explain everything, but it explained enough. We talked for hours, about my mother, about the past, about the years he'd spent wondering what might have been. He didn't speak with bitterness, which somehow made it worse. He spoke with resignation, with a quiet grief that mirrored my own. He told me he'd respected my mother's choice, even when it hurt. He told me he'd hoped I was happy wherever I was. When we finally parted, the world felt different. Not lighter, just altered. I had opened a door my father had spent decades barricading, and there was no going back. I didn't yet know how this would change my future, or what justice would ultimately look like. But I knew one thing with aching clarity. The diary hadn't ruined my life by being opened. It had ruined the lie that was never strong enough to protect me. After meeting Michael, I expected clarity, closure, something neat and conclusive that would tell me what came next. Instead, what followed was a strange limbo where nothing was settled and everything felt exposed. I had opened the door, yes, but now I was standing in the doorway, unsure whether to step forward or slam it shut. Michael respected my pace. He didn't call unless I did first. He didn't push for a relationship, didn't demand answers. That restraint only complicated things. It made him human, considerate, impossible to reduce to a symbol of betrayal or redemption. I returned home with a heaviness that had nothing to do with grief anymore. It was responsibility. Knowledge changes the shape of your obligations. Once you know, you're accountable to the truth in ways you weren't before. I started to notice how often people spoke about my father in glowing terms, how they praised his devotion, his integrity. Each compliment felt like a small knife, not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. I wondered what they would say if they knew the whole story. I wondered if they deserved to know. The diary became a battleground in my mind. Some days I wanted to throw it away, to deny it the power it held over me. Other days I wanted to photocopy every page and send them to everyone who had ever called my father a saint. Neither impulse felt right. Justice, I was learning, wasn't about exposure for exposure's sake. It was about balance, about acknowledging harm without becoming the source of new harm yourself. Michael and I met again a month later. This time, the conversation was less tentative. He asked about my childhood, about who I'd become. I asked about his life, his family. He showed me photos of his kids, their smiles bright and unguarded. I felt a pang of something I didn't have a name for: envy, maybe, or grief for a parallel life that had unfolded without me. He admitted that he hadn't told them about me. Not yet. He said he didn't know how to explain a daughter who appeared out of nowhere, carrying decades of silence on her shoulders. That was when the anger flared again, sharp and unexpected. My father's choices weren't confined to the past. They were still dictating what we could and couldn't say, who we could and couldn't be. His silence had become our inheritance. I realized then that doing nothing was also a choice, and not a neutral one. It preserved his version of events at the expense of everyone else's truth. Back home, I started to write. Not emails this time, but a record of my own. I wrote about the diary, about the shock, about the way love can coexist with betrayal in uncomfortable ways. Writing helped me see patterns I'd missed before. My father's fear, my mother's compromise, Michael's patience, my own hesitation. None of us were villains in the cartoon sense. None of us were heroes either. We were people, making imperfect decisions under pressure, leaving consequences for others to carry. When my aunt called again, I didn't deflect. She asked how I was coping, and for the first time, I answered honestly. I told her I'd learned something about my father that complicated my grief. I didn't give details, but the silence on the other end of the line told me she understood more than she was saying. Families, I was learning, often run on shared intuitions as much as shared secrets. She said only this: "Your father loved you, but love doesn't erase mistakes." It was the closest anyone in my family had come to acknowledging the truth. If this shocked you, comment justice below, because the hardest part wasn't discovering the lie. It was realizing how many people had quietly helped keep it alive. The pressure to decide what to do next mounted as weeks turned into months. Michael asked if I wanted to meet his wife, to explain things together. The thought terrified me. I imagined her face as the story unfolded, the way trust might fracture under the weight of something she'd never consented to carry. At the same time, I imagined my own reflection, years from now, explaining to myself why I'd chosen silence over honesty. That image felt unbearable. In the end, the decision came from an unexpected place. I was sorting through old boxes when I found a letter my mother had written to me years ago but never given me. It was tucked inside a book, forgotten. In it, she wrote about loving fiercely and choosing wrongly, about hoping I would be braver than she had been, about believing that truth, even when painful, was kinder than comfort built on lies. Reading her words felt like permission. Not to seek revenge or expose for spectacle, but to tell the truth carefully, deliberately. I agreed to meet Michael's wife. The conversation was one of the hardest of my life. There were tears, anger, long silences. She asked questions I couldn't fully answer. She accused my father of selfishness, my mother of cowardice, Michael of complicity. She wasn't wrong. But she also surprised me by turning some of that anger inward, wondering aloud how she would have acted in their place. By the end of it, nothing was resolved, but everything was real. Word began to spread slowly, unevenly. Not through gossip, but through necessary conversations. My family learned the truth. Michael's children eventually learned about me. Reactions varied. Some people withdrew, others leaned in. No one thanked me for telling the truth, and I hadn't expected them to. Justice didn't feel like vindication. It felt like exhaustion mixed with relief. The diary remains with me, no longer a weapon or a curse, but a reminder. A reminder that love can be genuine and still do harm. That protecting someone doesn't give you the right to erase parts of who they are. That silence, even when well-intentioned, has a cost that someone eventually has to pay. I don't hate my father, I don't absolve him either. I carry him with me in all his contradictions. Opening the diary didn't destroy my life. It dismantled an illusion and forced me to rebuild something more honest in its place. That process is ongoing. It's messy, it's painful, but it's real. And for the first time since his death, that feels like enough. The aftermath didn't arrive with drama or confrontation. It came quietly, in the form of changed routines and altered expectations. People treated me differently once they knew. Not openly, not unkindly, but with a subtle caution, as if I had become a reminder of something they preferred not to examine too closely. Family gatherings felt strained. Conversations skirted around topics that used to be safe. My father's name was mentioned less often, and when it was, it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. I started therapy at Michael's suggestion, though the decision was my own. I needed a space where I didn't have to protect anyone else's feelings, where I could say the unsayable without worrying about fallout. In that room, I admitted things I hadn't even let myself think. That part of me resented my mother for choosing peace over truth. That part of me feared becoming like my father, making decisions for others for their own good. That part of me wondered who I might have been if my life had started differently, without a lie at its center. The therapist asked a question that stayed with me long after our sessions ended. What would justice look like for you? Not for Michael. Not for my father's memory. Not for the family systems built on silence. For me, I didn't have an answer then. I still don't have a perfect one now. But I began to understand that justice wasn't a single act. It was a process of reclaiming authorship over my own story. Michael and I settled into something that wasn't quite a traditional relationship. We talked every few weeks. We shared updates, memories, observations about how similar our gestures were, how we both frowned when concentrating. There was affection there, but also restraint. We were learning each other slowly, aware that rushing would only recreate the same mistakes that had shaped our lives. His wife remained distant but civil. His children curious, cautious, unsure where I fit. I didn't push. I didn't need to belong in their lives, to validate my existence. At home, I went through my father's belongings one last time. This time, it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like closure. I kept a few items that still brought me comfort and donated the rest. When I came across the book where he'd hidden the diary key, I opened it and read the margins, filled with notes he'd scribbled over the years. They weren't about secrets or fear. They were about perseverance, about doing the best you could with what you had. That, at least, felt true. I decided to write my own account of everything, not for publication, not for an audience, but for myself. I wrote about the diary, about the choice to open it, about the consequences that followed. Writing allowed me to see how far I'd come, how much agency I'd reclaimed simply by refusing to look away. I wasn't obligated to make everyone comfortable. I wasn't obligated to preserve a version of my father that existed only because no one challenged it. One afternoon, months later, I visited my father's grave. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Standing there, I felt a mixture of emotions that didn't cancel each other out. Love, anger, gratitude, disappointment. I spoke aloud, not because I believed he could hear me, but because I needed to hear myself. I told him I understood why he'd been afraid. I told him he was wrong to decide my life for me. I told him I hoped he'd found the peace he'd chased through silence. When I left, I felt lighter, not absolved, but unburdened. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once, because the truth doesn't just expose wrongdoing. It forces everyone involved to confront who they really are. The story didn't end with reconciliation or perfect harmony. Some relationships remained strained. Some questions never received satisfying answers. That was something I had to accept. Real life doesn't wrap itself in neat conclusions. What it does offer, sometimes, is clarity. And clarity, I learned, is a form of mercy. I kept the diary, but I no longer read it. Its purpose had been served. It had shown me the cost of silence and the danger of misplaced protection. It had also shown me that loving someone doesn't mean excusing everything they've done. That understanding was hard won, but it was mine. When people ask now whether I regret opening the diary, I pause. The easy answer would be yes. Life was simpler before. Ignorance, as they say, is bliss. But simplicity isn't the same as peace. I would rather live with a complicated truth than a comforting lie. I would rather choose my own path than walk one that was quietly dictated for me. Opening that diary shattered my understanding of my past, but it gave me something in return, the ability to move forward without pretending. It forced me to confront the reality that families are built not just on love, but on choices, and that those choices have consequences that ripple outward, sometimes for generations. Facing that reality didn't destroy me. It strengthened me. I don't wish the experience on anyone, but I also don't believe we're meant to remain protected from the truth forever. At some point, we have to decide whether we want our lives to be authentic or merely acceptable. My father chose acceptable. I chose authentic. That choice hurt. It still does some days, but it also gave me something priceless, ownership of my own story. The months that followed were quieter, not because the story was finished, but because the noise had moved inward. Life didn't pause to let me process everything neatly. Work deadlines still came. Bills still needed paying. Friends still complained about ordinary problems that once would have felt important to me too. I learned how grief and truth can coexist with routine, how you can carry something enormous and still remember to buy groceries on the way home. Occasionally, the weight would hit me without warning. A song my father used to play in the car, the smell of cedar after rain, a passing comment from someone who said, "You were lucky to have such a great dad." Sometimes I corrected them gently. Sometimes I didn't. I stopped seeing those moments as tests of loyalty. They were simply reminders that people only ever see the version of a story they're allowed to see. Michael and I continued our careful connection, not a replacement for the years we'd lost, not an attempt to force closeness, but something honest. On my birthday, he sent a card with a simple line, "I'm glad you're here." It was enough. I didn't need him to make up for the past. I needed him to acknowledge the present. In a strange way, that acknowledgement felt like justice more than any confrontation ever could. I also noticed changes in myself. I stopped apologizing for asking difficult questions. I stopped shrinking when conversations turned uncomfortable. The diary had taught me that silence has consequences, and I was no longer willing to pay its price. When people I loved made decisions that affected me, I spoke up. Not angrily, not dramatically, but clearly. That clarity became my anchor. Every now and then, I would take the diary out and hold it, not to read, but to remember what it represented. Not betrayal alone, but fear. Fear of loss. Fear of conflict. Fear of letting the truth change things. I realized my father hadn't been unique in that fear. He'd just made the mistake of believing control was the same as care. Understanding that didn't excuse him, but it did free me from carrying his choices as my burden. Years from now, I may look back on this period as the moment my life truly began. Not because everything before it was false, but because this was when I started choosing consciously instead of inheriting decisions made for me. The locked diary was never the villain. The real danger was the belief that love requires secrecy to survive. If this shocked you, comment truth below, because stories like this don't end when the pages run out. They live on in the choices we make afterward. I've learned that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like boundaries. Sometimes it looks like difficult conversations. Sometimes it looks like walking away from comforting illusions and accepting the cost of honesty. I didn't expose my father to punish him. I exposed the truth so it wouldn't keep shaping my life without my consent. If there's one thing I wish someone had told me before I found that diary, it's this. Knowing the truth will hurt, but not knowing it will quietly hollow you out. Pain can heal. Emptiness just echoes. Opening that diary filled the silence with something real, something I could finally respond to. So if you're standing on the edge of a secret right now, wondering whether to look or turn away, know that whatever you choose will change you. Choose with intention. Choose with courage. And choose for yourself, not for the comfort of ghosts. Before you go, here's my last ask. If this story resonated with you, hit like so more people who need to hear it can find it. In the comments, tell me this. Do you think some truths are better left hidden, or does the truth always deserve to come out? And if you want more stories that dig into the secrets families keep and the strength it takes to face them, subscribe, because understanding these stories might help you survive your own.